Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to basically share the results of a very significant legislative reform that we've obtained in France after 7 years of an advocacy campaign led by 60 grassroots NGOs. So I think it's important to understand where it comes from and that it was very rooted into the realities of those service providers. Before that, I would say just a few words about the two structures I represent, because I think it also tells something about the process we implemented. So I represent a French NGO, Mouvement du Nid, which is a French frontline NGO established in 1946, and which reaches out every year more than 5,000 women, men, trans, and children in prostitution. And 85% through 26 frontline offices in 26 provinces in France. And 85% of those prostituted persons are actually foreign women, migrant women, and thus victims of trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation. And that's where we have to articulate, especially in Western Europe, where the majority of victims in prostitution are actually victims of trafficking, we have to articulate the two concepts, because that's the reality. So 85% of them are victims of trafficking, and they mainly come from Romania, Bulgaria, Nigeria, and more from China. I'm also the co-founder of a new international coalition, CAP International, that we've started only 4 years ago, and which gathers 23 frontline NGOs in 18 countries on 5 continents, so it's a new dynamic. And those NGOs provide direct assistance. They are grassroots organizations providing direct assistance to the victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation and prostitution. And the very specific aim of the coalition is to reinforce the members in their domestic and international advocacy capacities. So as I was saying, on the 13th of April 2016, the French Parliament adopted a comprehensive new legislation which basically fully revisited all criminal provisions and public policies related to prostitution and trafficking in France. So the legislation, which is a framework legislation, amended 9 legislative codes. So the criminal code, the criminal procedure code, the residency and asylum code, the social security code, the tax code, the education code, etc. So it was a major consistent reform, and I think that's extremely important to stress the need for consistency. That's something I've been trying to do again and again here. So I will list those provisions, and with a specific focus on those who are reinforcing the status of victims of trafficking and prostitution. So first of all, the law has decriminalized victims of trafficking in human beings for sexual exploitation and prostituted persons. For the last 76 years in France, people in prostitution were criminalized under the Solicitation Act. So that has been fully repealed. Women in prostitution, being foreign victims of French nationals, can't be criminalized for their situation. That was extremely important. That's the starting point. Then the law has also recognized as an aggravating circumstance any form of violence against women in prostitution and trafficking. That's also very symbolic, and that's a strong tool for lawyers, because any form of violence, being physical or sexual, is not minimized because it was a victim of trafficking, as it was the case, basically. It was taken less seriously. It's a legal aggravating circumstance of violence. That's a symbolic important element. Then the legislation has offered residency permits, including access to the worker market, to foreign victims of trafficking in human beings, even if they cannot or if they don't want to cooperate with the justice. That's key, because before there was a conditionality. Women, foreign women exploited in prostitution had access to a residency permit only if they were cooperating with the justice, and we all know that some can't because of the fear of retaliation in their countries of origin on themselves, on their families, and some don't want or are not prepared for that because it takes time to be psychologically and affectively fit for bringing elements to the justice. And what should we do for those victims as long as they can't cooperate? So this, the residency permit, there is no more conditionality attached to it. That was very important. The law also gives access to financial compensation, financial reparation for victims of trafficking and victims of pimping and procuring. That's articulated again. And this compensation has to be granted by the states when the traffickers and the pimps are not solvent. That's very important. It will take time to implement that provision, but the fact that the state has to guarantee that compensation if the pimps or traffickers are not solvent is a key asset. Thus, the law also creates a specific fund for the protection and assistance to victims of prostitution and trafficking, which is funded by the state's budget, but also by a new provision which aims at directly channeling the confiscation of the assets of pimps and traffickers to the protection and assistance funds for the victims. There was a kind of constitutional discussion and challenge on the constitutionality of this measure, which directly channels the confiscation for a specific nature of expense, but that's possible and that's being implemented now. The law also repeals tax and fiscal debts for women willing to exit prostitution and trafficking. The law creates a specific financial support scheme for foreign victims having no access to the French minimal social standards. It also gives priority access to social housing. It creates in each province, under the authority of the préfet, a kind of governor, a mandatory coordination mechanism, a local coordination mechanism responsible for the prevention, protection, and the development of exit alternatives. The law also amends the education code and introduces prevention in schools on the non-commodification of human body. It introduces also mandatory training for social workers on the realities of prostitution and trafficking. And the law, of course, has maintained all criminal provisions against pimping, procuring, and trafficking. And it was a small revolution, introduced the criminalization of the purchase of sex. So decriminalization of prostituted persons, but criminalization of the purchase in order to tackle the demand. And I would just like to conclude, if I can, by saying that the adoption of all these very progressive measures, I think that's one of the most, on paper, one of the most protective legislation. So the adoption of all these measures were possible only because the French Parliament had decided to take a clear stance on prostitution and trafficking. So the French Parliament has priorly recognized that prostitution and trafficking were forms of violence, especially against women, were a violation of human dignity and human integrity, were obstacles to equality. The Parliament has stated unanimously that prostitution and trafficking were violating several constitutional principles, and that France is an abolitionist country whose aim in the long term is a prostitution-free society. So I think it's important because, as I was saying yesterday, when victims of trafficking are exploited in a prohibitionist country, they are primarily considered as criminals and thus not adequately protected. And when victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are trafficked in a pro-sex work country like Germany or Netherlands, where pimps have been promoted sex entrepreneurs, where brothels are legal and licensed, thus they are primarily considered as happy sex workers and not as victims of trafficking. So I think there is a need for a global consistency on prostitution and trafficking, and on that basis it becomes very logical and needed to not criminalize the victims, criminalize the abusers, and provide effective alternatives and rights to those who are recognized as victims of violence. But for that, you need to recognize the harm of prostitution and trafficking. And thus, France has rejected very formally all those concepts of sex work, this artificial distinction between a bad trafficking in human beings and a good prostitution or a good sex work, or as a necessary evil, or even rejected the distinction between the forced trafficking, which is the only recognized in many countries, with the use of force, coercion, fraud, deception, and what would it be, the free trafficking? Trafficking without the use of those means. So I think that consistency and that clarity opened the door for a much more progressive provisions for the victims. Thank you.